Mara Ellison had always been the kind of woman who listened more than she spoke. In the small ranching community of Cedar Valley, Montana, that quality was mistaken for weakness. People saw her quiet eyes and her careful nods and assumed she had nothing important to say. They were wrong, but nobody bothered to find out. She had grown up on the edges of everything. Her father was a good man with soft hands and a gentle heart, the kind of man who apologized for taking up space. Her mother had spent 30 years making herself smaller so the people around her could feel bigger. Mara had watched all of this and told herself she would be different. But when you grow up in a house where silence is the safest language, it has a way of following you into adulthood. When Damon Cross chose her, everyone in Cedar Valley acted like she had won something. Damon was the son of the most powerful family in 3 counties. He was tall and confident, the kind of man who walked into a room and immediately became the center of it. He smiled at the right times, shook the right hands, and said exactly what people wanted to hear. The community loved him. They trusted him the way people trust someone who has never given them a reason not to. Mara married him at 24. She told herself it was love. Looking back later, she would understand that what she had actually felt was the relief of finally belonging somewhere. The early years were not terrible. That was the honest truth. Damon was not cruel in any obvious way. He did not shout or threaten. He was simply someone who believed, without thinking about it too hard, that his voice was the only one that mattered. When Mara spoke at dinner with his family, he would smile and redirect the conversation. When she made a suggestion about the ranch, he would listen with patient eyes and then do whatever he had already decided. When she tried to bring something important to his attention, he would say, "Let me handle it, sweetheart," and the subject would be closed. She managed the books for Cross Ranch. Every contract that went out, she had reviewed first. Every profit margin that improved, she had found the way to improve it. She negotiated with suppliers over the phone while Damon drove to town for coffee. She caught a billing error that would have cost them $40,000 and said nothing when Damon told the story at dinner, as if he had caught it himself. She kept telling herself that silence was a form of strength. That being the person who actually held things together, even without credit, was its own kind of power. But quiet power that nobody sees is not power at all. It is just labor. The moment everything changed came during a community meeting about the eastern grazing land. A development company had approached the Cross family with a large offer, and Damon was ready to accept it. On the surface, it looked like a smart deal, a lot of money for land that required expensive upkeep. But Mara had done her research. She had spent 3 weeks quietly reading water rights documentation, speaking to a retired county official, and working through the numbers herself. If that land was sold, the water access downstream would be affected. Smaller ranches, including her own family's land, would lose seasonal irrigation rights they had held for decades. The money Damon would gain would come directly out of the pockets of their neighbors, some of whom were barely staying afloat. She stood up in that meeting and said so. She was calm. She had her papers with her. She spoke simply and clearly, because she had always known how to do that, even if she had rarely been given the space to do it. The room went uncomfortable. People looked at Damon. Damon looked at Mara with that patient smile she had come to understand very well. He thanked her for sharing her thoughts and suggested they move on. The meeting moved on. On the drive home, nothing was said. Damon was very good at silence too, but his version was not gentle. It was the kind of silence that fills up a car like cold air. Within 2 weeks, Mara's name was removed from the ranch accounts. Within a month, she noticed that people in town were looking at her differently. A neighbor stopped by and said, in a kind and pitying voice, that she had heard Mara was going through a hard time and that she hoped she would feel better soon. Mara had never felt better in her life. She was more clear-headed than she had been in years, but she understood what was happening. The story being told around Cedar Valley was not her story. It was Damon's story, and in his version, she was fragile and confused and difficult. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday. She signed them. She packed what belonged to her, which was less than it should have been. She got into her truck with her laptop, $1,100 in her personal account, and 3 years of quiet fury that had finally found a direction. She drove south. Her college friend, a steady and practical woman named Denise, lived in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and opened her door without asking questions. Mara sat in the guest room for 30 days and allowed herself to feel everything she had been holding back. She cried. She was angry. She was afraid. She let all of it move through her, because she understood, on some level, that she could not carry it forward with her. It would slow her down. At the end of 30 days, she opened her laptop. For 2 years, while managing Cross Ranch's finances, she had been quietly building something in her spare time. Not a plan to leave. She had not known she would need to leave. It was simply that her mind had never been able to stop solving problems, and the problem she kept circling back to was this. Small ranching families across the region were being slowly destroyed, not because they were doing anything wrong, but because they were alone. They were negotiating contracts individually against buyers who worked as a coordinated group. They were taking whatever price they were offered because they had no information about what anyone else was being offered. They were competing against each other for the same limited resources, when cooperation would have made all of them stronger. She had been building a cooperative model, a structure that would allow independent ranching families to pool their negotiating power, share information, access group financing, and stand together when outside pressure came. She called it the Ridgeline Collective. She began driving. Not aimlessly, she had a list. Families she had met at agricultural conferences over the years. Names she had come across in county records and land management reports. She would arrive at a ranch, sit at someone's kitchen table, and listen for a long time before she said anything. She asked about their problems before she offered any solutions. She was good at listening. She had been practicing her whole life. When she finally explained what she was building, she did not oversell it. She showed them the numbers. She showed them what coordinated purchasing power would look like versus what they were currently managing alone. She introduced them to an agricultural attorney she had found through a referral. A sharp, quiet woman who had spent 20 years watching small operations get outmaneuvered and was ready to help level the ground. She found a regional credit union willing to explore cooperative financing. She rebuilt her own family's small ranch as the demonstration case, showing exactly how the model worked in practice, before asking anyone else to trust it. The first year, 6 families joined. By the end of the second year, 14. By the third year, 41 ranching operations across Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho were members of the Ridgeline Collective, negotiating together, buying together, protecting each other's water rights, and finally receiving fair prices for their work. Mara did not announce any of this. She had no interest in noise. She had learned something important in those years of silent labor at Cross Ranch, that the work itself was what mattered, and the work spoke loudly enough when it was real. She was sitting at her desk in her small rented office in Billings when the call came. A Ridgeline member in Cedar Valley. The development company had returned, this time with more money and political backing, moving county by county through the region. They had done their homework and identified the smaller ranches as easier targets, planning to buy them out one at a time before the larger families noticed what was happening. The member's voice was calm but worried. "They're moving on us," she said. "We don't have the strength alone." Mara drove north, back to Cedar Valley for the first time in 3 years. She did not tell anyone she was coming. She did not make an announcement or send a message ahead. She simply arrived on a Wednesday evening, checked into the only motel in town, and prepared for the public land use meeting scheduled for Thursday morning. She brought with her a coalition of 41 member ranches, legal representation from the attorney she had been working with for 2 years, a water rights study conducted by a certified environmental consultant, a counterproposal that had already been reviewed by 2 state legislators, and documents signed by 17 neighboring landowners committing to the alternative plan. The meeting room was full. Cedar Valley turned out for these things. Damon Cross was there. So were the neighbors who had accepted his version of her story. So were the people who had smiled politely when he redirected her at that meeting 3 years ago. Mara walked in, set her materials on the table, and when it was her turn to speak, she spoke. She was not nervous. She had long since stopped being someone who needed the approval of the people in that room. She was simply a woman who had done her work and arrived prepared, and the outcome had largely been determined before she walked through the door. She laid out the water rights issue with the same clarity she had tried to offer 3 years ago, now backed by professional documentation and legal standing. She presented the counter-proposal. She introduced the attorney, who spoke briefly and precisely. She named the 41 families who stood with the Ridgeline Collective and what their combined opposition meant for the development company's regional strategy. The room was quiet in a way it had never been quiet for her before. The development deal was blocked at the county level. She did not look at Damon during any of this. Not because she was avoiding him, she simply had no interest in his reaction. It had nothing to do with him anymore. It had not had anything to do with him for quite some time. Within the following month, 2 ranches that had sided with Damon during the original land dispute reached out to inquire about joining the Ridgeline Collective. She welcomed them the same way she had welcomed everyone else, with a kitchen table conversation, a lot of listening, and a clear explanation of the numbers. The Ridgeline Collective was written about in a regional agricultural journal that fall. The following spring, a national publication ran a longer piece about cooperative models in independent ranching, and Mara's name appeared in it, though not prominently. She was not building a name. She was building something that would last after the names were forgotten. She was invited to speak at a land management conference in Denver. She said yes, on one condition, that 2 of her member ranchers, both women who had been told their operations were too small to be worth protecting, would speak alongside her. The organizers agreed. All 3 of them stood at the front of a room full of agricultural policy professionals, and the women who had once been told they were too small spoke about what they had built together, and the room listened. Damon Cross sold the eastern grazing land 2 years later to a private buyer with no connection to the development company. The price he received was fair but not exceptional. Without the cooperative infrastructure he had never considered building, Cross Ranch began the slow process of becoming less than it had been. Not a dramatic collapse, just a gradual diminishing, the kind that happens when a place depends too heavily on one person's confidence, instead of many people's commitment. Mara bought back a small parcel of her family's original land, using the group financing model the collective had developed. She built a modest house on it. She planted a kitchen garden. She got a dog, a large and calm animal, who matched her energy exactly. She still did not talk much at social gatherings, but the nature of her silence had changed entirely. It was no longer the silence of someone who had been shut out. It was the silence of someone who was choosing when to speak, because she already knew that when she spoke, people listened. She thought sometimes about the woman she had been in that marriage, the one who reviewed contracts and found the billing errors and shaped the decisions that someone else took credit for. She did not feel angry about that woman anymore. She understood her. That woman had been quietly gathering everything she would need. She just had not known yet what she was gathering it for. There was never a moment of loud triumph. No scene where she stood over the people who had dismissed her and watched them understand what they had lost. Life is almost never that neat, and Mara had never needed that kind of ending anyway. What she had instead was a Thursday morning in Cedar Valley, standing in a room full of people who had once chosen not to hear her, and being heard. What she had was 41 families who called her first when trouble came. What she had was land under her feet that belonged to her name, and work she had built with her own hands, and a silence that was finally, completely, on her own terms. She had not found her voice somewhere along the way. She had always had it. What she had found was something harder to come by, and more permanent once you had it. She had found the ground to stand on, and she had built it herself.